And with that, I will hand things over to Tanya. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. Welcome again. We're grateful that you're spending part of your evening with us tonight. I'm Tanya Isa. I'm a board member with the Hudson Taconic Lands, and we will begin with our land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Tonight's speaker is Scott Jackson. His talk is entitled Designing Sustainable Landscapes, Generating Data on Ecological Integrity and Regional Connectivity to Inform Strategic Land Conservation in the Northeastern U.S. You can probably tell he's a professor. Scott is an extension professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass Amherst, where he teaches courses and workshops on wildlife conservation and wetlands ecology, assessment, and conservation. His research interests include aquatic connectivity, wetland assessment and monitoring, impacts of roads and highways on wildlife and ecosystems, and landscape-based ecological assessment. With colleagues in the UMass Landscape Ecology Lab, Scott developed landscape assessment tools and approaches, including the Conservation Assessment and Prioritization System, known as CAPS, Designing Sustainable Landscapes, DSL, and Critical Linkages. Scott also coordinates the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative, which is a network of practitioners in the 13-state North Atlantic region working to enhance river and stream connectivity. Handing over to Scott now. Please put your questions in the chat. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you, Tanya, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm going to share with you some of the work that we've been doing at the University of Massachusetts, and listed on the title slide are some of the key colleagues that have been working on the information that I'll be presenting tonight. We've been doing landscape-based ecological assessment for about 25 years now, and we still haven't gotten it right. So that's why we're going to continue to work on it. As data gets developed, as the ecology of landscapes becomes better known, there's always more that we can do. The basic outline for tonight is I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important to use a landscape perspective for land conservation, and then talk a little bit about some of the data that we've generated as part of our DSL project, Designing Sustainable Landscapes. In particular, I'm going to focus on the Index of Ecological Integrity and a suite of regional connectivity metrics. I'm going to show you what some of these data look like for your county, and then I'm going to demonstrate for you a new app that we've developed that's available for your use for prioritizing parcels for conservation. So why is it important to think about conservation from a landscape perspective? Well, I like to zoom out and sort of show this image as a way of sort of grounding us a little bit in the Northeast about just how lucky we are to live in such a forested landscape, because that's not really the case for much of North America. And the area in the Northeastern U.S. and neighboring Canada, New York, New England is very dark green because of the biomass of forests that we have. And if you look at a land cover map of forests in Massachusetts, where I work and where I live, it sure looks like a really forested area, even though Massachusetts is the third most densely populated state in the country. But underneath all that forest cover is hidden a lot of other things as well. And this is like the road network in Massachusetts. And so, as you probably know, a lot of the forest land has been carved up and is fragmented. And there's some real challenges in terms of maintaining populations of wildlife in these fragmented landscapes. So in fragmented landscapes, you have edge predators, which include things like opossums and skunks and raccoons, and corvids like crows and blue jays, brood parasites like cowbirds. And that can make it really challenging for other forest birds that prefer to stay in the interior away from the edges, and in some cases may be area sensitive, meaning that there has to be a certain size block of forest before they will even attempt to nest there. So a lot of times we focus on trying to maintain large blocks of habitat so that there are edge areas, but there's also interior areas for the wildlife that require that. We also need to think about landscape perspectives because some species use multiple different habitat types over the course of their lives. Turtles are a good example of this. Some aquatic turtles, like painted turtles and snapping turtles, need to leave the water in order to find nesting areas, and sometimes they can travel long distances to find suitable nesting habitat. Other species like wood turtles and the blanding turtle that's shown in the bottom right, they move from wetland to wetland throughout the landscape, crossing over dry land, crossing over roads, crossing through people's backyards. This is a map from a student that was doing work on Blanding's turtles, and it shows the same turtle, but in 2 different years, and the range of wetlands that it visited over that course of 2 years. So in the blue is where it went in 2001, in the red, that's where it hung out in 2002. And this is a different male that traveled from one wetland to another for about 6 kilometers before it was hit by a car and killed right at the top of the image. So we have to think about the impact of human development on these ecosystems. And in order to try to identify those blocks of habitat that are likely to sustain their value over time and not be degraded by, by roadkill, by edge predators, by other problems that are generated by people. So we developed a modeling system called CAPS, the Conservation Assessment and Prioritization System, to try to make sense of these complicated landscapes that we live in order to set priorities for conservation. The goal of CAPS is to try to estimate or predict what the ecological integrity is for every cell of the landscape. And we do that from one ecosystem to another. So ecological integrity we define as the long-term capability of an ecological community to sustain its composition, structure, and function. And so we think that being able to have high integrity means that you're going to be resilient to stressors over time and be able to maintain the condition and the habitat quality over the long periods of time. The approach is ecosystem-based. So essentially, we create separate models for shrublands and forests, for wetlands, streams, and we use a variety of different metrics that we combine together into models in order to create a score for ecological integrity. And so these are some of the metrics that are in our toolbox. We don't use all of these metrics for every ecosystem. We're selective about that. The metrics in orange are ones that we have in Massachusetts, but we don't have the capability of generating them throughout the rest of the region. Some of these are stressor metrics that are general. Others are watershed-based. And then we have 3 resiliency metrics called similarity, connectedness, and aquatic connectedness. The way the metrics work is that we look at the landscape and we score it so that we can identify those areas. In this example, the impact of road traffic on the ecosystem. So here's an area that's relatively unaffected by road traffic. We have another area over here where there's lots of different roads that converge, so it has a relatively high impact. And then we put it into a scoring system that then we can use a color map to illustrate, where the blue areas are the areas that are relatively free of road impacts, and the yellow areas are the ones that are more severely affected. In developing the scoring system, we weight by distance using a circular kernel. And what that means is that anything that's very close to a road is going to have high impact from those roads, and anything that's far away from the road is going to have much diminished impacts. So we weight by distance, and then we weight by class too. So that means that if you're class E, which might be an interstate highway, you're going to have high impact, much higher impact than a class A road, which might be a dirt road or a gated off rural road. And so by weighting roads by class and then when weighting the by distance, we can come up with a combination of the two that we use for scoring every one of those metrics, the stressor metrics, watershed metrics, and resiliency metrics. And we then rescale them from 0 to 1 so we can combine them together into a model that then scores IEI, or Index of Ecological Integrity. When we deal with the watershed metrics, we actually don't go with a circular window approach, but instead we use a time of flow model so that as water flows to a particular point designated by that yellow star, those areas of the landscape where water gets there most quickly are going to have the highest impact on that point. So we essentially every point along the stream, every point in a lake or a pond will have a watershed generated, and then all the metrics will be weighted by the time of flow. So then once we've created all these metrics, we can then take different combinations of those metrics, weight them one against the other, and then combine them together to create an index of ecological integrity with a different model for each type of ecosystem. And then as these are all combined together, you get a color map where the areas in the darkest green here represent the areas of highest integrity, and areas in pale green are areas that are considered of low integrity. And again, scored on a 0 to 1 scaling. And then that 0 to 1 scale can be adjusted for the entire 13-state region so that a 1.0 is the best within the entire region. We also have a version of IEI that's scaled to each state and each ecoregion and each watershed. And so using IEI, you can identify perhaps some of the really important areas that you want to create as core areas for your conservation network. And what you're seeing here is some of the cores that were developed for the Nature's Network conservation plan, showing core areas. So you can see Western Massachusetts, and then you can see where you're located just up here at the intersection of Vermont, Massachusetts, and New York. So the first step is sort of identifying where these core areas are and trying to get them protected. And sometimes it's very intuitive where the core areas should be. In other cases, the model helps sort of distinguish what might be a little bit better than something else. But that's not the end of it, because when you think about what it takes to support viable populations of wildlife, it's important to understand some of the metrics that we use for how we evaluate the viability of populations. So we have a rule of thumb that we use, and I emphasize with my students that this is just a rule of thumb. It's not a law, it's not something that you're held to, but if you want to have a viable population, you're going to need at least 500 to maybe 2,000 individuals in a population. And when you look at some of these animals that occur at relatively low densities, like bears, one bear for every 1,400 acres, one pair of barred owls for every 1,660 acres, bobcats, one pair or one bobcat per 3,200 acres, you multiply that by 2,000 and you got a lot of land. So essentially, when we look at this in Massachusetts and we look at what's already protected as open space, there's not a single blob on this map that's big enough to maintain viable populations of those free-ranging animals. So what you need to do is connect these together. So interconnected protected lands is what it takes to protect viable populations of all the different wildlife that we want to maintain. So I'm going to switch now from talking about ecological integrity to talking about connectivity. When we think about aquatic connectivity, it's not hard to know what pathways these animals need to take in order to maintain connected populations. They're going to follow the stream set. And it's not that difficult to figure out what the obstacles are going to be as well. There's dams, and in many cases, there's culverts. And so you can go through and start to use models and other things to identify what are your high priority culverts and dams for removal or replacement. But it gets a little more complicated in the terrestrial environment because there is no obvious pathways. And so when we're trying to figure out how to connect one area with another, it does help to have some models that can help inform those decisions. And connectivity is important, not just for things like bears and bobcats, coyotes, fishers, whatever. They're important for everything that lives where we live in New York and in New England. And why is that? Well, it wasn't that long ago where all this was ice. So, 15,000 years ago, there was a half a mile to a mile of ice in New York and in New England. And essentially, all living things were pushed out of this region. And when the glaciers started to retreat about 12,000 years ago, that was an opportunity for things to move back into this area. So everything that we have today, in terms of plants and animals living in the landscape, had to get there over the last 10,000 years or so by moving through the landscape. And so that includes a lot of things that don't find it very easy to move through the landscape. So small animals like redback salamanders, moles. Moles are always intrigue me. I wonder how they get around in this world. How do they cross roads? How do they get through parking lots or anything like that? It seems like they may be actually confined to really small patches of habitat. It also has to do with wind dispersed seeds from plants or ant dispersed plants like the bloodroot that's shown in the lower right-hand corner. So when we think about connectivity, we have to think about it not just from our most mobile species, but also a lot of the really small animals or animals that are really constrained in terms of how well they can move through the landscape. And all of that warming and all of that movement is still happening today. It was happening even before global warming became a problem. But now with climate change, it's just happening faster. And so these shifts of geographic distribution, as species begin to redistribute themselves according to the conditions that they survive in best, is accelerating because of changes in seasons, changes in temperature, changes in snowfall and snowpack, and how that might affect forests and forest regeneration. So in addition to identifying core areas with the highest integrity that you want to protect, you have to figure out which are the most viable pathways to connect these core areas together into viable conservation networks. And so part of our work, and shown here as part of that work for Nature's Network, involved developing metrics for regional connectivity. And our first metric of that type was called conductance. And so the areas shown in green on this map are the areas that have high conductance, that make the best opportunities for connecting these cores together with connectors. And that network of cores and connectors then can sort of identify a hypothetical conservation network that would be viable over long periods of time. And this again is the Nature's Network showing forest cores and forest and terrestrial cores and connectors. So we were pretty proud of this stuff. We worked hard. We worked for many years on this. But then we started to work with it a little bit, and we found that it had some shortcomings. So one of the shortcomings with our connectivity metric is that when we developed it, and this is an early version of that conductance metric, we identified core areas, and then we figured out the easiest way to connect them together. And so it looks really good in an image like this because the yellow core areas have all of this connective tissue in purple that hold them together and make them look like a nice, big, viable network. And it is. The problem is that not everybody uses the same cores, and not everybody has the same priorities for lands that they want to link together. And so we have a project or a program in Massachusetts, a combination of state agency and the Nature Conservancy called BioMap. And BioMap is a blueprint for biodiversity conservation in Massachusetts. These are the core areas that were identified by BioMap. along with our conductance index in purple. And you can see now it does a pretty lousy job of connecting up the cores. So you get a different set of cores, and that connectivity metric really isn't as good as you thought it was. And if we look at protected open space, the same problem. It doesn't connect up all of that open space into conservation networks that are going to be viable over time. So as we think about connectivity, there are a couple things we have to think about. One is that having it be dependent on cores is problematic. So what we really would like to have is something that doesn't depend on cores, that looks at the inherent connectivity of the landscape so that you can then overlay any core network that you want to connect, and it'll do a reasonably good job of connecting them together. And the other thing that we need to recognize is that when we look at those big blocks of habitat that are of high quality, most of that's forest. So we are a heavily forested part of the country. And so even though it may include some wetlands and other things, that is being dominated by what forest and forest animals might need. So if we think about some of the animals that live in the forest, not all of them are dependent on the forest for movement. So things like bears, coyotes, and bobcats will easily move through farmland, move through residential areas. And so they're not confined to forest. So we don't necessarily have to restrict our analysis to forests. But on the other hand, there are some species that are really going to stick with the forest for the most part. And so there are some animals that are generalists, and there are some animals that are more specialists. And forest specialists like fishers and gray foxes, but also can't forget the smaller animals, the ones that are not quite as mobile, flying squirrels, redback salamanders, hairy-tailed moles. But there are also species that would not use forests to go from one place to another. So wetland-dependent species like mink and otter, they may move overland, they may actually move through the forest, but they're going to be better connected where there are wetland connections and where there's short distances between the wetlands that they utilize. And so wetland connectivity is what's going to be most important for these species, along with a variety of other ones that are also going to be more limited in their ability to move through the landscape. And so in addition to being core independent, we looked to try to develop regional connectivity metrics that were also ecosystem specific, so that you could have one set of connectivity for forest animals and another for wetland species. So this is what we just recently completed. We call it EcoConnect. And our objectives for developing these metrics was to have something that's truly regional throughout the Northeast. It's ecosystem based, it's independent of defined conservation core areas, and it would operate well at multiple scales. And so let me just quickly run you through how we developed this suite of regional connectivity metrics, and then show you some of the results. So we start by taking our map of IEI, the Index of Ecological Integrity. And in this case, I'm going to use forests as the demonstration. So this is just IEI for forest communities. And we tiled it out into little squares, 2 kilometers square. And in each of those squares, we identified the single point in that had the highest IEI score. So now we create a whole series of nodes, thousands of nodes across the landscape. And then for each of these nodes, we try to connect it with every other node that is within 5 kilometers of that focal spot. So we do that using a process called random low-cost paths. So a lot of times people use least cost path analysis for connectivity, and there's certainly merit to that. But what we realize is that wildlife don't know where the least cost path is. So just because you identified it as the least cost doesn't mean that's where wildlife are going to go. And often there are lots of other pathways that are almost as good as the least cost path. And so we said, let's try to maintain multiple pathways, but they're all relatively good. So we call those low cost paths, and we derive them by putting a little bit of randomness into the model, so that instead of just one one way of connecting each of these nodes to this focal node in the middle, there are many different pathways. So we do 30 random low-cost paths to each of the neighboring points. And then we do that for each of the neighboring points to every other point within 5 kilometers of those points. And eventually we end up connecting up all of these different nodes into what we call a local connectivity. So this is not yet regional, but it is a way of sort of beginning to look at the underlying connectivity potential for the entire landscape. And then computationally, we shift to another way of looking at things. And this is called graph theory. And this is where we take all of the nodes and we connect them with just straight lines that we can code, but we're not really looking at this distinction between these different dots on the map. And so within graph theory, there are different metrics that you can use. One of them is called betweenness. And so betweenness, in what we end up doing is trying to connect every pair of points within that 13 state region. So every possible combination is computed in the computer, and it identifies the most efficient way to get from one place to the other. So this could be from the Adirondack parts out to Provincetown on Cape Cod. It could be Arcadia Park in Maine down to Washington, D.C. And then every one of these lines connecting a dot gets scored by how many times those lines get used in order to connect all of these different points throughout the landscape. So in that way, we can determine which of these connections is really the most important from a regional perspective. And then we take those lines and we use that random low-cost path analysis to sort of blur them out a little bit and provide some variety so that there's actually multiple pathways, and that's how we get our regional connectivity. And so we do that independently for forests and for non-forested wetlands, for ridgetop communities, for floodplain forests. And to test it all out, I said, okay, well, let's look and see how well it works with a variety of different core systems. So this is the forest regional connectivity metric showing, Massachusetts and surrounding areas. So if we then overlay the core areas from Nature's Network, you can see that they connect up really well. So even though we used a different approach entirely, it still managed to connect those cores up very well. The biomap cores, they're actually pretty well connected now. Protected open space, likewise, it seems to do a pretty good job of connecting these up. So we were very happy, we're very satisfied that we think we found something that is an improvement on what we had before. As I said, it is now truly regional too, because it connects every 2 points within the entire 13 state region. It's not tiled together local connectivity, but it is actually regional connectivity. And here you can see again how, just in a close-up map, how you have different cores, and then looking at how well they're connected by this forest connectivity metric. We also looked at how well it scales. So you can look at the entire 13 state region and you can see the lines that define some of the most important connectivity zones throughout the region. But you can also then zoom in on like the Baltimore, DC area where there's a fair amount of development. And you can see there's a lot of connectivity there that you could use to prioritize land for conservation. You can even zoom in to just downtown Washington, DC, and you'll start to see ways of connecting some of the open space within DC into a conservation network as well. So again, we were satisfied that it does seem to scale well so that you can use it within a single town, or you can use it at a county level, you can use it at a watershed level, at a state level, or even broader than that. We get different results depending on whether we're doing connectivity for forests or wetlands or ridgetop communities. And it's really interesting to look at the results. We didn't really know what we would end up with in the end, and it was fascinating to study some of the results. So what you can see here on top is forest connectivity. So if you have core networks and you're saying, how do I connect them together? You might say, oh, well, this is pretty clear. Right here is important, right here is important. But yeah, that's important for forests. But if you go, I'm sorry, if you go to ridgetops, there are different areas that are really important there. And so if you go to wetlands, now you're going right through the middle of places that are completely blank for ridgetops. Totally makes sense because you don't have a lot of wetlands on ridgetops. So the ridgetops are up high and the valleys down below support the wetlands. And now you have to think about connectivity for a range of ecosystems and a range of species. And it's a little bit more of a complex puzzle than what we had before. So now I'm just going to show you what some of the results look for Rensselaer County. So here's our index of ecological integrity. And here you can see in the orange is the county. And you can see if we zoom in that there's a large part of the county that rates very highly in terms of ecological integrity, especially in the eastern half and the southeast in particular. But that's only one way to value land is for its ecological integrity. You also want to value land that's important for connectivity. So if we look at forest connectivity, you can see where the strength is down in the southeast. We zoom in, you can see where the threads are that would represent the best ways of connecting, not just within the county, but connecting the county to other areas in New York, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, and up through Vermont, Massachusetts. Here's wetland connectivity. It's a little bit different. And you see a lot of this connectivity is now vertical, north-south, rather than diagonal, like the forest connectivity. And it includes western part of the county as well. So that area that didn't show up as very important for ecological integrity turns out to be very important for wetlands and wetland connectivity. If we look at floodplains and floodplain forests, you see a lot of white. There's not a lot of floodplain forests in the Northeast, but there happens to be some in your county. And it's along the edge, the western edge of your county, but also cutting through the northern part of the county as well. So these areas that didn't show up as important for ecological integrity turn out to be some of the most important in the region for floodplain forests. And then one of my favorite ones to look at is ridgetop communities. So there are a lot of plants that are dependent on dry ridgetops. And in this case, your county is very important for ridgetop communities. So you can see how it runs right up the eastern part of the county. And its importance is most obvious when we scale out and look at the broader landscape. So as it turns out, if you want to connect ridgetop communities from the Catskills to the Adirondacks, you have to go through Rensselaer County to do that. Not only that, but you have to go through eastern Rensselaer County. So it was really fascinating to see these patterns, to see this shelf fungus growing into the Adirondacks, and that the way to connect this with Pennsylvania is to go through, far eastern New York State or through Vermont and Massachusetts to get there. So I remember when we first started showing people the results of our regional connectivity stuff, a man who leads the state agency that gives out a lot of grants for land conservation in Massachusetts said to me, he said, I really love this stuff. I think it's great. I just wish there was some way that we could figure out how to offer points for grant proposals that actually protect regional connectivity. So we took that as a challenge and we said, okay, I think we can build a tool that can be used to score parcels for connectivity and also for ecological integrity. And so what I'd like to do in a minute is demonstrate for you this new app that we've developed that's live, and you can take this URL and you can use it yourself starting tonight if you wanted to. So I'll leave it up for a little bit while I talk a little bit about the app, and then we'll move to a demonstration. But basically what we wanted to do is figure out how we could create a system where people could either draw or upload a parcel. So you could upload a parcel as a shapefile, or you can just draw it, or you can draw a portion of a parcel where you're most interested in protecting, and then you can score it for ecological integrity and for connectivity. So before I move on to that, let me just also let you know that if you want to learn more about DSL, the Designing Sustainable Landscapes project, you can go to our website. It's just umassdsl.org. And from there, there's links to our IEI page if you want to learn more about the models for ecological integrity. We also have a page for EcoConnect, which gives you a link to this tool, gives you a link to just a browser that map viewer that you can use to zoom in and zoom out and look at the patterns. There's documentation. You can also download the data to use in your own GIS programs as well. So that's the end of my presentation. If you want, I can pause if there are any questions before we go to the demonstration.
There aren't any questions in the chat, so let's go to the demonstration.
All right. Okay, so here's the app. And there are a couple of different ways that you can use it. So first thing is you can zoom in and zoom out to find where you want to go, or you can type an address into this little box here at the bottom. So in this case, I can put Rensselaer County, New York, and boom, we're there. And so now what you're looking at is the forest connectivity for that. You can actually turn on any of these layers to get a better look at it. So you can look at IEI based on the 13 state regional scaling. You can look at it from a state perspective. Sometimes these don't change very much. Sometimes they do. It depends on the area. You can look at it from the ecoregion perspective or the watershed perspective. And then the connectivity layers are for forests, for wetlands, for ridgetops, and for the floodplain forests. So you can, browse, you can zoom in, zoom out to get a better look. We have this. If we go down here, you can see there are different kinds of base maps you can use to look at it. So in some cases, when I'm looking at trying to zoom in for a particular location, I find all of this green a little bit problematic, so you can turn off the layer. And then you can go to an OpenStreetMap and zoom in, look for a property that way. You can load the topographic map for the area. You can load aerial imagery for the area. And that is all ways of trying to orient to locations where you might want to zoom in and look at a particular parcel. Let's see, I was looking at this. This is one place that I was looking. So I'll do this as a demonstration. So I'm going to zoom in and say, here's Pittstown State Forest, Grafton Forest, and Grafton Lakes State Park. And you say, okay, how important is this land in between them all, and either for connectivity or for ecological integrity? And since I don't have parcel data for that, I'll have to draw it in by hand. You go up to this button and you hit the draw button, and then hit this icon for draw a polygon. So now I can say, all right, I'm going to now just click around the edges. Now, this might not all be just one parcel, but I'm going to treat it as if it is all one parcel. Click on your starting place, and that completes your polygon. And now you can look at anything you want to look at. You can look at index of ecological integrity. You can look at forest connectivity, ridge tops, wetlands, floodplain forests. If you're sitting there and they say the green is just too getting in the way, I can't read everything, you change the opacity. So you lighten it up so you can see better. Then you can darken it up if you want to see in greater detail. But that's all just playing. The key thing is you just go up here to this button and say hit report. And so it's going to ask for a project name. I'm just going to call it gap. Gap analysis. Generate report. Give it a few seconds. And there's your report. So what this will tell you is the date that you ran the report, the name that you gave it, and the description that you provided. It tells you the size of the area that you delineated with your polygon. In this case, 1,393 acres. Tells you what Huck 8 watershed you're in, and then indicating that this is run by version 1 of this model. Under in the table for ecological integrity, you can see the results for the entire region based on statewide scaling, ecoregional scaling, or watershed scaling. And you have two choices that you can look at. All means that you're getting scored based on the mean IEI score for the whole parcel that you drew. Best tells you what the mean score is for the best 50% of that parcel. So of the cells that make up that parcel, those that scored in the top 50%, because sometimes when you buy land, there may be some farmland associated with it. There may be houses. There may be areas that are right up against the road. So we thought it was useful to know what's the best land on this parcel and how does that score. So you get both scores. So it gives you the score, but it also gives you a percentile. So for the entire parcel, it scores in the top 23% regional, top 16% for the state, 20% for ecoregion, and 20% for the watershed. But when you look at the best part of that parcel, it's in the top 6% regionally. It's in the top 3% for the state, top 3% for ecoregion, 3% for watershed. So that's a situation where you'd say, wow, this is a pretty solid piece of property. You can also look at it from a connectivity point of view. And in this case, all is the entire parcel, and best is the best 25%. Because sometimes you just get this corridor that cuts through the corner of your parcel, and it's really compact, but it may be really important. So we didn't want to go with 50%. We went with 25%. And the areas that are in bold are the ones that are in the top 10 percentile. So here you can see for forest connectivity, it's in the top 2% regionally, top 2% at the state level, and the top 6% watershed wide. And you can see how it scores for the other connectivity metrics as well. It doesn't look bad for ridgetop either, top 15%, top 13%. And then there's just notes here that describe what it is you're looking at in the tables. And then it shows a couple of maps to show you the shape of the polygon that you drew and the location of where that polygon is relative to other areas nearby. And so our thinking is that if you want to apply for a grant and you have a property that's really important for connectivity, but doesn't score high in the normal metrics that might get you points towards that grant, you could just take this report and add it to your grant proposal and submit it. Or if you happen to be somebody who gives out money, you work for a foundation or you work for a state agency, this is a way that you could find out whether a property is important for connectivity and therefore one that you want to support. And you don't have to wait for the applicant to do the report. You can do it yourself. So you can upload that shapefile or you can draw that polygon and you can say, I wonder how this scores when it comes to connectivity. So that's the tool. We can try another one and just sort of see how it works in another location. So let's do something up here. Let's zoom in, turn off the layers. All right, let's do something around here. along the river. So we did that blind, so we don't really know whether that was going to be good or not, but it's good for floodplain forests. Pretty good for wetlands too. So I'm expecting it to score well in those two categories. Not so good for ridgetop, but that's not a surprise. And then we do have an area of forest connectivity as well. So let's get our report and take a look. And so you can see for integrity, it's not super special. It's not bad, but it's in the bottom scoring. So probably if you were to propose this for grant proposals, they would say, well, it doesn't really score very well on some of our habitat quality metrics. But look at the connectivity for wetlands and for floodplains. It's all in the top 10%. The entire parcel and even the best part of the parcel, all of that is in the top 10%, not just for the county, not just for the state, but for the entire 13-state region, Northeastern U.S. So this is a way to sort of put an exclamation point on your grant proposal and say, look, this is not just important for the county, but it's a much broader importance. The last thing I want to just show you is how we upload polygons. So you hit restart, and if you have a shapefile all ready to go, you can either upload the 3 most important files, or you can just go to the zip file and take the whole thing. So in this case, I'm going to take this parcel. It zooms right into where it is. And again, focusing on connectivity, you see the sort of green wash ridge tops. It's a little bit better on the western part. It's a lot of blue, so it's pretty good for wetlands. Nothing for floodplain forest. What's also possible with this is, some people, when we had beta testers test this out and give us feedback, they said, it'd be really great if we could see where the protected land was relative to the parcel that we're looking at. We said, yeah, that would be great too. We could not find a reliable source for protected lands for the entire 13-state region. Some states have good data layers for that. Other states, they're not really credible, or they have gaps. So we said, well, it's too bad, but we really can't figure out how we could do that. But then Brad Compton, who created this tool and who did most of the programming for the metrics themselves, he said, well, what you can do is allow people to upload their own base map, as long as it's not too big. So you can't necessarily do parcels for the entire state, but you could probably do all protected land for your county. And so the one that we set up as a demo was just parcels for this one town of Warwick. And so go here, user base map, Warwick parcels. And now it shows you all the parcels. You could have put all the protected land in Warwick. If you had that shapefile, you could have loaded that and had that be now one of the base maps that you can use as you're sort of looking at the different patterns and trends. Index of ecological integrity, wetland connectivity, etc. And so that's our tool. I could show you the report, but I think you get it by now.
Yes, Scott, there's gratitude for showing us the new tool. People are saying it's great to learn about the new tool. And there's a question: how does their connectivity modeling at the eco-regional scale compare to some of the other models like TNC's connected and resilience landscapes? Would they be used in concert, or does the scalability of the UMass model give it broader application for finer scale conservation planning?
Yeah, A good question. We often get asked about how our work compares or contrasts with the TNC resilient and connected landscape. There are elements of the connected landscape that come from our local connectivity metrics. So we work with TNC quite a bit, and some of these products are a little incestuous as we sort of steal from each other. For the IEI versus resilience, one of the key differences there is that Nature Conservancy is not looking at the ecosystems. They're not looking at the biological elements of the landscape. They're looking at landscape diversity. So they're thinking about 500, 1,000 years from now, when we can't even predict what kind of ecosystem would be there. Where would we likely see the most biodiversity? Because there's a lot of niches, a lot of complexity in the landscape. Whereas CAPS has models that are specific to different ecosystems, forest ecosystems, wetland ecosystems. We don't really think that the forest is going to change into something different over the next 500 years. It may be a different type of forest, but it's still going to be forest. So they both have validity. The two together probably tell you a better story than either one by themselves. But it's important to know that the conceptual basis for these two products are very, very different. And when it comes to the flow that they use for connectivity, their flow, unlike our regional connectivity metrics, are not ecosystem specific. And also, our flows look at the origin point and look at the rest of the landscape through the eyes of what that point is. And so all the landscape that's similar has the least resistance for traveling through it. And most dissimilar cells are the ones that are likely to be avoided, or are going to be high cost cells to go through. And so that is calculated separately from every point in the landscape when it looks at the landscape around. Thank goodness for really good computers, because it does take a lot of computing power to do this on a 13-state region. But also, our connectedness is really truly regional rather than sort of tiled together version of connectivity. So some of it is in the methodology, but some of it is conceptually based. And conceptually, ours is ecosystem based, and their connectivity metric is not. And same thing with our IEI. Our integrity is ecosystem based, whereas their resilient landscape is based on landforms instead of ecosystems.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. Next question, how did you identify wetlands for mapping?
Yeah, so basically we worked with the Nature Conservancy's classification of the land's cover. And so all the different forest types, all the different wetland types and things comes from the Nature Conservancy. And it's something that we're aware that all of our source data have errors in them. So we don't expect that you're going to be able to see this as a flawless output, but we use the best available information that we could in terms of wetlands and forests, and then we can calculate ridgetops based on topography.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions? I have a question from earlier. How do you map a turtle in 2001 before you could GPS that turtle?
The radio tags. So basically you get a fix on them every day. They don't go very far in a given day. So you can basically determine where they are and calculate their route based on that.
Thanks.
Hey, I want to, acknowledge that it sounds like bragging when I talk about this. We're really excited about what we did. We know that there's going to be problems, and there's a place on the app where you can report problems that you have or mistakes in the data. So feel free. Our skin is thick. We know that there's probably going to be problems, and it's not to my role in the DSL team is generally the public face. I do a lot of presentations. I go to meetings. I get the grants to try to fund this work. But it's really important to understand that I didn't do this work. I was part of the conceptual part of it, but Brad Compton deserves a huge amount of credit for what you saw tonight. Ethan Plunkett is another member who's done an enormous amount of work on the DSL. And if you go to our DSL website, you'll see that there's a lot of other data there too. We have a risk of development model. We call it the urban growth model. We have models for specific species. We have models based on future climate projections, refugia. And we also have all of the metrics that we use for these models are also separate data files. So if you want to work with just road traffic intensity, or if you want to work with connectedness or similarity, you can download those metrics and use them for your own purposes. So I hope you'll find it useful.
We have another question and a comment that bragging is justified because it looks like an awesome tool and some excitement about trying it out. The question is, how do you account for landscape barriers in regional connectivity, such as the Hudson River?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways that we deal with that. One is that we score every cell based on similarity of the landscape around it. So basically, unless you're an aquatic organism, the Hudson River is going to be high resistance because it's going to contrast with anything terrestrial. So, and then every cell of the Hudson River is going to have that same cost. So in order to get across a really wide water body like that, or a waterway, you're going to get tax, toll after toll after toll until you run out of resources and you don't get all the way across. So that's how the resistance of the river works. For highways and development, we just have different categories. We will do highways based on traffic intensity and the size of the highway. So we will then set a resistance value for the highway itself. But where there's an underpass system, that's in some cases, like in Western Massachusetts, in the Adirondacks, people are assessing road stream crossings for terrestrial passability and for aquatic passability. We can then take that cell of the roadway and change its resistance value to show that it's passable here. And so that will tend to channel the connectivity routes through that underpass and on to the other side. There are lots of barriers that we can't account for. We can't account for Jersey barriers along the roads. We can't account for fencing or other kinds of things like noise barriers and other things that can really block the movement across roads or highways or other places, just because we have no source data where we can know where those barriers occur. So those are certainly things that we're going to miss.
Thank you. So we are just about at time. If anyone has a last question, time to pose that now. Otherwise, we will thank you, Scott, very much. And thanks everyone for joining, and watch the website to see what's up for January. And
thank you very much.
Lots of thank yous, Scott, in the chat. If you don't see it, everyone really enjoyed your talk and learned a lot.